And it seems that you're absolutely right. Like Hezbollah's attacks is causing significant damage to Israel right now in Lebanon, and Israel struggling in their ground operation. So it's they've exceeded a lot of people's expectations, not yours, but mine and others.
Well, I look at it a little differently, I suppose. I think Hezbollah, which of course, as you know, is a creature of Israeli occupation, it didn't exist until the Israelis went into southern Lebanon and occupied the place. Initially, the Shiites there were very happy to see the Israelis, but that honeymoon did not last very long. But I think Hezbollah, like any number of other organizations in the Muslim Arab world, is organic. It's rooted in the soil. It's part of the region. So the notion that you're going to eradicate it completely or annihilate it, I think, is ridiculous. It's the same thing with the Houthis. They're rooted in the region. They are there. So you have a choice. You can either get along with these people and find a way to do so, or you could end up like the Israelis in a state of perpetual war with your neighbors.
Yeah. We haven't spoken in a while. I think it's been a couple of weeks. We spoke in the early days of the war. Things have changed drastically since. A lot of people were talking about whether Trump will off-ramp in a few days by mid last month. Yeah, we're on April 1st. There's an address to the nation that's coming up in a few hours. The Iranian president also sent out a letter just a few minutes ago to the American people, addressed to the American people. But let's start with just a broad question, Colonel. How do you see things right now? There's kind of two extremes. On one extreme is Trump is sending troops, and this could be an Iraq 2.0. And the other extreme is Trump is seeking an off-ramp, and Iran will probably give him that off-ramp in the next few days or maybe next couple of weeks.
I'd like to see the evidence for an off-ramp on offer from Iran. I haven't seen that. Can you tell me what that is?
I haven't seen, there's nothing direct. They've actually said the complete opposite. There was a statement by the Iranian president that got traction yesterday where he said Iran doesn't want a ceasefire, but they want an end to the war and they want reparations for the war. Now, that's different to their demands. Their demands include more things than just that. But people, to be honest, I also think Iran, despite their statements and despite them wanting to have deterrence for a future conflict, they also want the bombing of their country to stop. They suffered a lot economically with the sanctions and now suffering a lot. Despite them beating expectations with their military capabilities, they're still suffering daily bombings. So I also think Iran want to end the war. The only question is based on what terms. And I think this is where hopefully they meet in the middle.
Well, I don't think there's a middle. That's the problem. I think Israel's demands are unchanging. And that is one of the reasons why I think President Trump this evening will say that we're looking at 2 to 3 more weeks to, in his words, quote unquote, win the war. Now, that is based on the assumption that everything that the American people and others in the West have been told about the success of the air and missile campaign is true. I don't think it is. Why would you now suddenly want to introduce ground troops in any way, shape, or form if you are successful with your air and missile campaign? But we've been down this road so many times in the history of the United States since World War II. My first question is, well, if we're so successful and we've done all the damage you claim, why would we need any ground troops? And nobody ever provides an answer. The fact is that we have not been successful as we've claimed. I think we're lucky to have disabled or destroyed perhaps 20 to 30% of Iran's missile power. I don't think we've had the impact on that at all that is claimed. And I've watched the air campaign from a distance, and I've seen something I've seen before from the Air Force. The Air Force reaches a certain point and it runs out of genuine military targets. And then it says, what do I do? And then you go through this process of trying to justify hitting large quantities of infrastructure that have no real military utility or value at all, because that's what you can see. That's what doesn't move. So I think we're engaged in an effort to, quote unquote, destroy Iran, destroy its infrastructure, try to make its population as miserable as possible. But we haven't achieved, contrary to what they're saying, all these great goals and objectives. And as far as a nuclear capability is concerned, I would say that whenever this conflict ends, very shortly thereafter, Iran will probably have a nuclear weapon. Because the real lesson people in the world are drawing from this campaign is if you don't have a nuclear weapon, you're a middle-sized power, and you disagree with Israel or the United States, then you run the risk of being attacked. Ergo, you'd better get a nuclear weapon so that you can deter attacks. So I don't see where any of his goals have been met. The other thing is he seems to think that Iran shut down the Strait of Hormuz. No, it didn't. Lloyd's of London shut it down because a war broke out. Why did the war break out? Because we started the war. We caused the Strait of Hormuz to be shut down because no one wants to risk moving their tankers through the place. So you've gone from 75 oil tankers every day down to perhaps 3 or 4, a total of perhaps 150 or more ships a day. But as far as tankers go, the average before the war was 75 a day. Now we're looking at all these critical shortages. You know, if the fertilizer problem is not addressed pretty quickly, we're going to have famine in 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 months. People all over the world. We're talking about Africa. We're talking about Asia. You know, you're not going to be able to produce the microcircuitry that you're producing in Taiwan, Korea, or Japan because they're not getting the helium. I mean, this is a catastrophe of global proportions. And nobody in Washington seems to have cared. The entire focus was this is what Israel wants, Israel gets. And Israel will never be safe and will never be able to dominate the region unless Iran is destroyed. The words that you hear all the time on Capitol Hill, we're taking Iran off the board. Well, right now, I think the opposite is the case. I think the war to this point is setting up a situation where the Gulf Emirates, along with Israel, are probably going to be off the board. Now, why do I say that? Well, what have we seen? We've seen all of these air and missile defenses that have been built fail. Israel is no longer launching anything in response to the missiles that are falling on it. The missile defenses that are in the Gulf Emirates have not performed to expectation. And the Iranians have made it very clear that once we recommence to fight them, in other words, when we reignite or reinitiate the air and missile campaign, when we've replaced roughly 11,000 munitions that we expended under the previous campaign that are precision guided, they are going to respond in kind to us. So if we hit the desalination plants, we hit the oil infrastructure, they're going to turn around and do that to the Gulf Emirates. And I would just point out to people there are over, I think, 50 desalination plants on the western side of the Persian Gulf. If you look at Al Jabail, the Saudi port, there is a huge desalination plant that is there. That was vital to us, by the way, during Desert Storm. I mean, we were receiving fresh water every day in vast quantities in bottles from the time we landed in Saudi Arabia until we left. We couldn't have done anything without that. It was always a mystery to us that our good friend Saddam Hussein did not simply line up 10 scuds and hit the desalination plant, but that's history. But the point I'm trying to make is that 90% of Riyadh's drinking water comes from that desalination plant. If that desalination plant is destroyed, Riyadh will have to be evacuated because there's no water to drink. Now that's going to repeat itself through the UAE, potentially Bahrain, Kuwait, and so forth. So I don't know what Trump is going to say tonight, but I think he's going to tell us we're looking at another 2 to 3 weeks of attacks to finish the campaign. And he's going to claim they've had all this success. And oh, by the way, he's going to say we have ground troops and we are considering our options. Well, I think most people have heard the options. The options are inserting these ground forces onto islands inside the Persian Gulf. Now, I don't know if they're going to use all of them or some of them. I have no idea. But I also know that the United States Navy is staying hundreds of miles away from the Persian Gulf. So the real question is, how do you get those troops into the Gulf? Do you infiltrate them into the UAE? That's eminently possible. That can be done. But we live in a different kind of world now. We're dealing with a different kind of warfare. It's not asymmetric. It's the difference between the World War II force that we have with new things and a very different kind of warfare. And this warfare is what I've been talking about for years, which is ISR strike, the ability to take intelligence, surveillance, reconnaissance platforms overhead, in space, in the terrestrial environment, even sensors on the seabed. Link all of those through a central command structure. When I say central, it's not entirely central, it's distributed, but nevertheless, there is a command structure back to multiple weapon systems that are designed for standoff attack. What are those? IRBMs, intermediate range ballistic missiles, tactical ballistic missiles, and of course, the multitude of drones and cruise missiles. The ability to see something and within a minute or two decide to attack that target from somewhere inside Iran is revolutionary. Now, the Russians demonstrated this capability over time in Ukraine, and the Ukrainians have lost tremendous numbers of manpower as a result of this. You're seeing this now employed against us. So when you talk about ground troops, first you got to get them there. They have to get there without necessarily being identified. You're still going to have to concentrate them in some fashion. Then you have to transport them out to these islands, whatever islands that you decide to attack. And then you're going to try and protect them on the islands. Well, our air and missile defenses haven't turned out to be very effective. And most of it is sitting on destroyers offshore, a great distance from the area where we are probably going to put troops. In other words, I don't see much evidence for success with these new operations because we can't neutralize those capabilities. And historically, I just wrote a piece that's on my Substack, and I quote the former Deputy Secretary of Defense, Robert Work. And he actually wrote this in 2010, a former Marine officer. And he made it very clear, if we cannot neutralize this kind of battle space network with all these standoff attack weapons, we're not going to conduct any amphibious operations. We're not going to conduct any air mobile operations, because if you try to do it, you're going to take unacceptable losses. So I don't know where we're headed other than to say it looks like more of the same. And I'm going back to the targeting problem. Do we go back and hit some of the same old targets and hope for something better? Have we found some new targets? Is the enemy complacent? The enemy just sits there quietly and waits to be found? Has the enemy repositioned any of its assets? I think this is a much bigger challenge than I think Donald Trump and his military advisors and political advisors ever anticipated.
That last point is interesting. Iran has proven itself to be very adaptable. The fact that they were able to fire more missiles today than they have in weeks against Israel, while continuing their daily strikes on the Gulf, while keeping the Strait of Hormuz shut. Now, I know you said they didn't keep it shut. Lloyd's is not ensuring ships going through the straits because Iran's made the threats. They struck a few ships. I think one was struck by a drone a few days ago. But the strait is only closed for, as Iran says, countries that are part of the war, directly or indirectly part of the war.
Unfriendly to Iran is what the foreign
exactly. Correct, yeah. There's one big concern. We've spoken about this, me and you, and you've actually been very alarmed about this in previous conversations before this war. That's America's air defense munitions. You were talking about how low they were during the Ukraine-Russia war. And now we're here. Today, there was a report, Pentagon locked in a 7-year deal with Boeing and Lockheed Martin to triple productions of the PAC-3s, which some people are saying they're completely out or almost out. There's been reports of PAC-2 munitions found, I think, in Kuwait. How significant is that issue, and how did we get here? It just perplexes me that everyone's been talking about this issue, even people that are very hawkish and very pro-US, concerned about this issue, and then we get into this war and deplete them even further. What's the thinking behind it? Is it possible? I had one expert on my on my show a few weeks ago. Now he's like, Mario, that's because a lot of these air defense systems are becoming obsolete and new systems are being developed and they're going to be launched and replacing the old ones. And that usually happens. A lot of countries have all that weapons, all the munitions that have left over. So it's actually cheaper to use that all that equipment and munitions rather than dispose of it. So could we be seeing that in action right now?
I suppose so. I think the bottom line is this. Our manufacturing base, whether it's military or commercial, has atrophied. We have no surge capability. When people think of the United States and its military power, as Donald Trump does, his mind is lost somewhere in the distant past, when we were the quote-unquote arsenal of democracy, when we produced hundreds of aircraft every month, thousands of tanks every year, this sort of thing. The Chinese can produce 1,000 rocket motors for cruise missiles and ballistic missiles in one day. We're lucky to produce 10 or 15 a week. So my point is very simple. We don't have the kind of capacity that we've had in the past. So how have we gotten away with this for so long? Well, if you pick relatively unchallenging opponents, you can defeat them, beat your chest, and pretend to be powerful. That's why in a book I wrote, A Margin of Victory, I had the opening chapter about the British Expeditionary Force in 1914. And they were good soldiers. They did many things well. But what was the problem with the British Expeditionary Force? It was a child of imperialism. Britain had been policing an empire for 100 years. What kinds of opponents had they largely encountered? Weak ones. And if you can dominate your enemy with firepower, you don't pay much attention to how much was needed, just that you had enough and you had the right weapons. I mean, General Kitchener's comment at Omdurman in 1999 says it all. Somebody said, well, General, to what do you attribute your success? He said, we have the Maxim gun, they don't. Well, he was right. So whom have we attacked? Afghans, Iraqi Arabs, people with minimal military equipment, no air defenses, no air forces, no real naval forces. I mean, if you pick the right enemy, you can look really, really good. So after 1991, we tended to move in the direction that we encouraged our European allies to move, into what I call this category of boutique forces, designed for limited operations over limited periods of time. And then we pushed a lot of our reserve capacity for logistical sustainment and so forth and transportation into the reserves. Well, that's what the British did. And it made sense because everyone with a brain in Britain knew whatever you did, you didn't want to go to war with Germany on the European continent. If you did that, you'd end up fighting for years. Cost you 1 million dead. And that's exactly what happened. But we were stupid. The British were stupid. We bailed them out. We bailed them out twice in 2 world wars. But the real lesson is you don't commit your force for something it was never designed to do. Iran is a fortress. It's an enormous fortress surrounded by mountains with some nasty deserts in it, particularly if you land in the south and want to head north. And the population is not like the populations in the Sykes-Picot states. You know, the various Arab tribes that were grouped involuntarily into new states that never existed. This is a real country. They have a real identity and an age-old culture. We wrote this off and we added, oh, no, we'll be through with this in a few days. And I'm sure that's what the Israelis said because that was their experience with most of these Arabs. And they've had a hell of a time with Hezbollah because Hezbollah is different. It's not like the others. Where the Arabs have turned out to be very effective is in organizations like Hezbollah and Hamas, where it's tribal. It's rooted in something. It's rooted in identity and culture and language and everything else. So we're in a terrible pickle. And our friend Donald Trump faces public humiliation here in the United States and overseas. I think we're already the laughingstock. And everybody who knows anything about military history knows that trying to control a strait like that is very difficult. The British tried it in 1915 in the Straits of Dardanelles. And they went in with 75,000 troops. 9 months later, when they decided to break off and leave, having been defeated, they withdrew 500,000 men. And this is the country with the greatest navy in the world. We have the greatest navy in the world. But what do you do at a strait? You know, the people that control the strait are always the people ashore that surround it. And the high ground on the strait is Iran. And Oman is not going to support us or help us in any way.